What I'm going to talk about today is my experience of implementing a rather novel aspect of assessment, really, formative assessment, with my second year undergraduates in diagnostic radiography. It's called a wiki, and I'll explain what a wiki is as we proceed through here. But a wiki is basically a device for students to work collaboratively online and produce an object that is able to be assessed, and all this will come through during my talk. Well, thank you very much, Sally, for that introduction. It's very complimentary for me. As I say, I'm the newly appointed head or theme lead of research and practice in higher education at the university, and I'm also a senior lecturer in medical imaging sciences in Carlisle. We train around 16 undergraduates in Carlisle and around 60 in Lancaster in diagnostic radiography. That's a Bachelor of Science degree that I am involved in, but I'm particularly interested in postgraduate studies in magnetic resonance imaging. That's my speciality, my field of interest. And I run the postgraduate course in magnetic resonance imaging at the university. So moving along, there we are. So what we're going to talk about today is different ways of approaching assessment in groups. What is computer-supported collaborative learning? This is the kind of umbrella term that this wiki has been developed under. How I did introduction of the online wiki, how I did it, the research I did, the cycles of the action research project that I did. The research project was part of a larger PhD study that I did. Well, I completed it a couple of years ago. Going forward too quickly there. What I'm going to hopefully develop is key points around collaborative computer-supported collaborative assessment in using online technologies, some future research possibilities that I've identified, and summarising that we need to provide more well-developed collaborative learning using Blackboard and other tools, particularly appropriate, I think, at the moment when we're in this COVID-19 pandemic, and we need to think about using online tools on an individual basis for students, but particularly when we're trying to encourage students to collaborate to provide this sense of community of practice that we need to engender in students. And that's quite difficult when we're teaching online, but this is one way of doing that using this wiki. Okay, so the established formative assessment we had in the second year of the undergraduate program was based around, if I can just, looking at a particular module that students had to look at a particular disease, in this case heart disease, and think about presenting this topic area, heart disease or coronary artery disease, in fact, and how to present this to the group of students. So ordinarily we have students down here presenting in a group the fruits of their research in heart disease, for this example. They were to look at the etiology of heart disease, coronary artery disease, how it happens, how we can diagnose it here using a stethoscope, but also particularly important for my purposes, how we use technology to diagnose the disease. This is a CT scanner, computer tomography scanner. And of course, the symptoms of heart disease, angina here, and building this together to give a very good appreciation of heart disease. As I say, 10 to 15 minute presentation to the rest of their peers in the group. So that's the established formative assessment. We give them feedback on their verbal feedback after the presentation, and then they produce a summative assessment at the end of this module that is a paper-based assessment that goes through the same processes, but they have to discuss a different disease, but go through the same kind of process of developing their arguments. Okay, so what I thought would be a good idea is to replace this with an online learning package, this wiki. The wiki is familiar to us all. Hopefully I've got a wiki here that I can show you. There we are. If I go to here, Staff Hub, it's a bit smaller. This down here. Okay, so we're all familiar with Wikipedia. Sorry for rushing through this for you. All familiar with Wikipedia here. It's a web page that anyone can contribute to. In this case, it is about a CT scanner, and it has hyperlinks here that you can click and go onto other pages. So I think we're all familiar with the way Wikipedia works. So the idea was for students to produce a Wikipedia page essentially around heart disease in that example I gave there. So I can come back to the presentation, and this is an example of a wiki. Wiki is Hawaiian for quick. It's a very quick and hopefully straightforward way of presenting information online. So this is the wiki that the students produce about diagnostic imaging using CT here, and a contents page as well. So they've used hyperlinks here to actually, we can actually click these and that will take us to a Wikipedia page. So the idea is that students can collaborate on this wiki in, Dumfries here, Sunderland, Carlisle. They can be in their hometowns, their home cities, and work on this one learning object, the wiki, to produce a nice, concise account of their research. Okay, so the lens I was using in my study was student approaches to learning. Hopefully all reviewers here are familiar with the terms of surface learning and deep learning. This is around the student approaches to learning, which has been introduced by, I think it's Martin and Saljo in 1976, introduced this terminology, deep and surface learning. So that was the kind of lens that I was using to use during the study. Authors like Biggs, Thomas, Biggs particularly is keen on this terminology of surface and deep learning, as are others. Entwistle has been a prolific writer on this student approach to learning, using terms like deep and surface learning. Deep learners look very deeply into the topic area. They research widely. They ask questions of staff, of each other, and have a very broad overview of the topic, while surface learners tend to be very surface in their approach, do almost the very bare minimum of work for the topic area, and often see study as a means to an end. They want that ticket to be able to work as a diagnostic radiographer, in my case. Also, constructivism is a key area of contemporary higher education. This is an emphasis on self-regulation of the learner. The lecturer is more there as a facilitator of their activities, and there's a greater emphasis on project work and collaborative learning in general, as well as traditional tutorials and lectures. So student collaboration, is it useful? Well, there are very great benefits for collaboration in general. Develops confidence in students. They develop their oral communication skills. They learn from each other, and their interpersonal skills are improved. And there's an opportunity for reflection as well. They get feedback on their efforts as well, and from peers as well as tutors. There's some negativity, and this is anticipated from students. They expect to learn from the teacher. We're paying all this money, we want to learn from the teacher. They don't want to learn from each other. Students not contributing, and having to explain to other students who perhaps don't kind of get the ideas is seen as a negative aspect. When we turn to using online technologies versus face-to-face, there are some studies, in fact quite a few studies, which say that online learning can actually promote higher levels of collaboration amongst students. And I think it has this way of having a more neutral workspace and the quite ebullient characters that are often take over projects in when collaborating, that their influence is somewhat diminished in online. It's a more egalitarian workspace in many ways. The more times you take online collaboration ideas, online learning activities, that's the word, the more self-regulated learning students gain. And that's an important thing. We'll see this in a minute when I discuss my results. So what is computer-supported collaborative learning? This is a terminology that's been used for the last sort of 20 years. It's basically using computers to encourage collaboration amongst students. Developed in the first talk of it was in 1995, and it involves lots of research in psychology, education, computer scientists at a very high level to develop technologies that we actually use. Of course, I'm using it in a more practical way in my research. But what is common amongst all computer-supported collaborative learning is that there has to be a set of instructions for students to go ahead and do their activity with, a setting for it, and also the constraints, how long is it going to take, for example, and that sort of thing. What feedback are they expecting? All these sort of seen as constraints. Has to be rules as well. So scaffolding is often used to encourage smaller scale activities that build together to make a larger project. And as we'll see later, this semi-structured interface is important in developing wikis. If we use a wiki in its raw form, it can be quite difficult for students to comprehend. We can also monitor the interactions as well. That's an important area. It's a big advantage. I can see who's contributed to the actual wiki, and it eases facilitation as well. I can see how, if students are struggling in a particular area, I can sort of push them in the right direction, and also use my big stick if I see that students aren't contributing so well. There are a few studies, sorry, I just moved on a bit fast there, a few studies examining the effectiveness of computer-supported collaborative learning in terms of the self-regulation of learning of students. That's an important area that's developing in momentum at the moment. This was something that worried me when I saw it when I was doing the initial readings for my studies. This is a nice table which demonstrates, although it comes from 2008, I think it's still pertinent today, 12 years later. Things that are familiar to students, things that are unfamiliar to students, things that they're not comfortable with using, and things that they are comfortable with using. Okay, so students are comfortable with using instant messaging, they're familiar with it, and they use it all the time, as we know in class. At the other end of the scale is this one here, making wikis. That was seen as unfamiliar and not comfortable with using, and we'll see in a minute that many students didn't have any experience at all of making wikis in my study. So that presented a little bit of a challenge to me. How was I going to introduce these wikis to the students? Okay, so my action research study had 2 cycles in it, separated by a year. So with 2 cohorts of students. I gave them an online questionnaire afterwards, asking them about their perceptions of the wiki and the PowerPoint, their experience of actually carrying out the wiki and the PowerPoint, what they thought about collaborative learning in general, and I also encouraged them to explore some of their feelings about collaborative learning, particularly online learning, with their experience of doing these wikis. I had a range of students, but I selected for my study, in-depth study, the students who exhibited surface learning tendency and other students who exhibited deep learning tendency, to see if there was a difference between their experience, really, of doing these wikis. and PowerPoints. Okay, I won't go into too much detail about this, but my themes were 8 themes, as you can see there: confidence levels, division of the workload, wiki production process. Interestingly, there was no talk in any of the feedback that was given about their experience of making Microsoft PowerPoint presentations. That seems to be a very robust process for the students. They've done many PowerPoints in the past, so that's familiar to them, but certainly the wiki production process was new to them. So my results, okay, so if we look at the previous PowerPoint use of students, this is cycle 1 and cycle 2 down here. So you can see I've got deep learning students in blue, surface learning students in red. You can see that students had quite a lot of experience of making PowerPoints in both cycles here. You know, some students had experience of making 10 plus Microsoft PowerPoints. Conversely, the wiki use of students in both cycles, this is cycle 1, this is cycle 2, was very limited. Most students had no experience at all of producing wikis. One student had worked with a computer company in the past, and he was a mature student, and he'd made 10 wikis with his company. But he was very, very much the exception. So no students had any experience of making wikis at all. This is an interesting aspect that I found. When I was looking at motivation of students as part of the study, one of the questions was, I shouldn't have done this course. Basically, a lot of students who had, well, some students who had surface learning tendencies, they agreed to some extent that they shouldn't have done the course here. They were the only students who did. All the deep learners were happy with being on the course in both cycles here. But it was the surface learners here that had some disagreement, that they felt they shouldn't really be studying on the course, and therefore they lacked a purpose in their studying. That's an interesting aside, but I think it's an important one to realise that surface learners, from my research here, do seem to be rather demotivated in the course, or some of them do anyway. So quotes from cycle 1. So this is cycle 1. This is when I introduced the wiki at the start, and in cycle 2 I made some adjustments to it, as I'll show you in a second, and it's just interesting to see what the students thought of it. Okay, so here's one student. Everyone was a bit confused to start with. Okay, I think everyone liked the sound of it, but they weren't sure how to work with the technology and get onto it. It's quite a familiar pattern of a student experience. They were quite confused when we introduced it at first. The one student said it was explained well, but because it was new, everyone was a bit like, oh, what's this? I don't want to do this. It's new. I don't know it. So everybody was anxious. So there was quite a lot of anxiety in the student group that I wasn't really aware of at that time. As the wiki itself, the research was more detailed and in-depth. The information was written rather than presented. Students felt they were able to write quite a lot more in the wiki than doing a Microsoft PowerPoint presentation. Disadvantage is you don't learn from the wiki. You don't have to memorize what information you'd researched and understand it. Okay, that's a quote from a surface learner 24, S24. I don't feel that wiki was as beneficial as presentations personally. Okay, so there's a few students who felt that the wiki wasn't at the same level of socially constructed knowledge that the PowerPoint gave them. Quotes, writing a wiki, it will be easier than a presentation. Students often like this, of course. There was no presenting element. Presenting introduced a lot of anxiety with students in the PowerPoints. So for many students, avoiding that presentation was attractive. Without the pressure of presenting and making a PowerPoint presentable, I felt able to read around the subject more. Okay, so that was a deep learner. Wikis were a good way of linking knowledge and understanding of the subject and creating an interesting layout and presentation. This is a quote I like. It meant the same work as the Microsoft PowerPoint presentations, but not having to present it at the end. So basically all the good things. Okay, so that was a surface learner, very much in favor of wikis. So in summary, cycle 1 told me that the PowerPoint gave a much greater perceived level of socially constructed knowledge. Amongst the students, that was a kind of overwhelming finding. This PowerPoint was seen as challenging due to this public performance element, but they learned worthwhile skills through that. Wiki was a significant challenge to students. It was unstructured. I gave it as a kind of raw wiki, really. They had to create a lot of the content themselves, at least the headings for the wiki. And as I say, they'd not used it before. The software, surface learners found the wiki software quite challenging. They were the ones to certainly highlight that compared to deep learners who found it less challenging in general. Wiki, quite a few comments from surface learners to say that they found them less valuable than the PowerPoint presentations. A couple of students said it was a poor use of their time. Okay. So what did I do to change that? Well, I made a number of changes for the wiki with the second cohort, the second year of delivering them. I used a much more structured template and considered the same areas as the final assessment, so it's more closely linked to the final assessment. It had the same headings in the wiki. I gave the students a choice of pathology, so they were able to sort of own the wiki based on their pathology that they were interested in, the group. Feedback was more structured as well. I gave it on published criteria. I told them I was going to feedback on certain elements, and that gave them, I felt, more structure to their feedback. And an important thing here is a longer and more in-depth practical session. So we gave the students a wiki and they worked on it together in the computer lab, in their groups, to sort of get to grips with the software in a more an easier environment than being separated by distance and time. Well, generally, we sort of emphasize the value of collaborative learning to the students and encouraged communication options. For example, WhatsApp, Messenger. Students in cycle 1 said they used that a lot to communicate with each other as they were making the PowerPoints, as they were making the wikis. So we encouraged these tools, social networking tools, to encourage communication and collaboration amongst the students. So what differences did that make? Well, it made some quite significant differences, really. The wiki was more equivalent to the PowerPoint in terms of socially constructed knowledge. That was both deep and learning tendency students said this, that it was much more equivalent to the PowerPoint in terms of the knowledge they were able to gain. There were no reports in cycle 2 that the wiki was a poor use of time. And as I say, more than half of surface learning tendency students in cycle 1 reported that they felt that they were wasting their time doing the wikis. So that was a really good finding. Fewer reports of software problems by the surface learning tendency students. Okay, so much less software problems apparent by these students who had surface learning tendencies. All the surface learning students were now satisfied with the amount of collaborative activities on the course, much more uniform appreciation of collaboration in the course. Okay, so a consistent finding was that only online, in terms of online learning, only deep learning tendency students seemed to appreciate how online learning was useful to them. There was no discussion at all about producing the Microsoft PowerPoint presentations compared to the Wiki, where there was a lot of comments about producing them. It would seem to be a standard technology that they were happy to use. Anxiety in giving PowerPoint presentations was very, very high in all students, but particularly the surface learning tendency students, and there was some quite worrying sort of admissions by many surface learning tendency students that they were particularly anxious about giving PowerPoint presentations.
Ian,
Yeah,
it's Sally. Sorry to interrupt.
Yep.
I wonder just whether you could just sum up very quickly now, because I'm just aware of the time.
No
and
problem.
I just think it would be good because we're beginning to get some questions.
Oh, sorry, right. Yeah,
and we're all chomping at the bit to ask them.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll just whip over that then. Yeah. Okay. So. Yeah. So, just to summarise this. Obviously, we can see that student approach to learning can influence the way students perceive online learning activities, and we need to, it can influence how we design them. They seem to welcome group work activities in general, which is great. It's a relatively small sample size, but definitely could be scaled up, and we could compare different groups, maybe nursing students, radiography students, social work students, arts students. It could be quite an interesting area to compare. Perhaps we should use student approach to learning when we're configuring groups. So send a questionnaire out. How do they approach learning, and use that in making up groups rather than saying, we should have a mix of different achieving students in the groups. Okay, so very quickly here, the Wiki definitely supplements other forms of formative assessment. It increases the variety of assessment, and quite a few students did say that they appreciated different forms of assessment, and this, added to their armory of experience. Definitely do some sort of trial run in a computer lab, particularly recommended for those with surface learning tendencies who found the software quite difficult to get to grips with. And, think about accommodating different learning approaches when designing and implementing online learning activities, collaborative online learning activities. So just acknowledgements, Professor Don Passy was my doctoral advisor at Lancaster University Education Research Department. He supervised a study, and obviously thanks to all the anonymous students who provided the information that I was able to analyze and use in my findings. Okay, there's some of my references, and I suppose any questions really. That's the important thing.
Thank you, Ian.
Okay,
that was really, really, really helpful. Some very interesting points there. I'm just going to make a suggestion that we go in the order of the chat. So Jack had a question. Jack, I don't know whether you want to ask that question, and then Anne Kendrick, then one from me as well.
Yeah, sure. I'm just fascinated, Ian, by your focus on learning and collaborative learning.
Yep.
And I've done quite a bit of work, for example, on Gert Biester's work, where he says, look, we've got a very well developed language of learning, but actually we've only got a weakly developed language of education. Now, in 2021, the American Education Research Association has made the theme accepting educational responsibility. And I'm just curious about whether you've ever focused on what is it that makes the learning of your students educational? Because not all learning is educational. It could be a complete technical exercise. So I'm just curious about whether you've ever thought about analysing your students' learning in terms of the values that actually constitute the learning as educational.
Yeah, is that, you talk about sort of metacognitive sort of aspects rather than the direct learning of facts, and the way they learn, I suppose.
Not just the way they learn, but also the values that actually constitute learning as educational, because clearly not all learning is educational. But I'm just curious why, it's not mentioned within your presentation. I understand about collaborative learning, the theories of learning, But I would have thought as a higher education lecturer, I'm being tutored by somebody who is a professor of educational research, that you might have focused upon what is educational about the learning that is going on. But,
right, okay. Yeah, that's a good point. I'll make a note of that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Anne?
Hi Ian, mine was a very simple question. I'm sorry if I missed this at the start, but how did you determine which were your surface and deep learners?
Right, it was based around a questionnaire that the assist questionnaire that's been used by Noel Entwistle. He was the a great, I think he still does work on student approaches to learning. So it's called the assist questionnaire, and that was just given out to the students, and they filled that in, and from that I determined the students who had a surface learning tendency and those students who had a deeper learning tendency. I was very careful not to call them deep learners and surface learners. That was an important aspect. They had a tendency to one or the other.
Yeah. Is that a tool that's available freely, or is that something that has to be bought?
Yeah, I've got it in one of my references there. It's from one of the books that Entwistle wrote, 2002, I think it is the reference.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's published and freely available then?
Yes, it is. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We'll leave mine and go straight to Marie and then Pete. I think Marie might not be able to get her microphone to work. So Marie was just talking about John West Burnham, who talks about surface, deep, and then went on to talk about profound learning, and right. She thinks that might help in terms of Jack's question. It's interesting actually, because that links in with what I was asking, which is the idea of rather than surface learners, those who engage in surface learning. But I'll ask my question now then. So right. I kind of wanted to ask about those who felt they were engaging in surface learning. Did they feel that they were forever doomed to be surface learners, and what role can the tutor play in encouraging a growth mindset, to move them on towards deep and profound learning? Yeah, and I also had strategic learning as well in there, but anyway, carry on.
Yeah, that's it. The students weren't aware of, when they filled in the questionnaire, whether they were surface or deep learners, so they weren't able to sort of reflect on that, really. I just use that simply as a tool to sort of, as a lens, I suppose, to look through the how students are experiencing it. Yeah. So as I say, they weren't aware of their tendency towards deep or surface learning.
Yeah. So did you use your study to kind of move them from surface learning tendencies towards deep or profound learning, or?
No, the two cycles were two separate cohorts of students, so they weren't related in that sense. Yeah.
But do you now, with your students now, as your thesis informed your practice now to move students on? Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, it's made me more aware of the way. Deep learning is hopefully the way students should learn, and through reading their testimonies, I can see that surface learners need to be encouraged in or directed in certain ways, and we need to be aware that they see things differently, I suppose. Education experiences differently. Yeah.
Okay, so Pete and then Marie have questions. Would you like to ask them?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I'm sorry I came late. I was a bit hectic with domestic arrangements, but I enjoyed your presentation. I saw the findings anyway, and I'm really just extending the conversation we've had so far, right? Starting with Jack and through Sally and another colleague who chipped in, I suppose. First of all, I think we have to be very careful, because in schools, people slip into deep learning. It's all tangled up with mastery and stuff like that. We're talking about approaches to learning research here, which was phenomenographic research. And what it did was so the survey that you used was based on phenomenographic research, which means it just mixed up all the conceptions of learning among the students, the data, and identified the different conceptions. So one student could have, more than one conception of learning, and then it depends on what approach to learning they then adopted. So the later research said, well, what does Pete tend to do when he's studying this module? What they did real world sort of research then. So my issue builds on what Sally's saying. That did your study not raise some questions about, say, I was having to do a PowerPoint presentation, and I was adopting a surface approach to learning, and then suddenly I'm on the wiki doing a collaborative project, and I'm much more. There's a certain distance to it, There's more of a different kind of performance, if you like, and I could respond. I believe that learners can perform in different way, depending on the context. That's my experience. But also, didn't you find that the surface learners, like your findings suggest, don't they?
Yeah.
Was it that, as Sally is suggesting, was it that learners, it wasn't just a question of their feedback, it was also that they were changing your investigation, did it identify change of approach to learning by some students? Is that what you're saying you found?
Well, I didn't see a change in approach, but what I saw in general was that surface learners were less kind of motivated. You could see that in one of my graphs, that they were not very happy with doing the course. Quite a few of the surface learners, they seem to be less motivated, certainly to online learning as well. So it's just to perhaps make an awareness that surface learners, as I say, some of them are less motivated and don't seem to go naturally towards online learning. That collaborating online seems to be quite difficult for some of the students. Surface learners, as I say, in particular, stood out there. Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, you can build on that. Yeah, certainly, and that's part of my research is perhaps to follow through students from the beginning of the studies. How they experience it, and perhaps surface learners and deep learners may experience different things, and perhaps we move slowly towards a more deep learning approach using our techniques that we can introduce.
I'm very wary of labeling learners, because I think that's a response to their context.
Yeah,
they are. So I would want to look at developing learners and moving them towards a deep approach to learning. And I think that's what Sally was getting at as well. I don't like this typology. When on the day they filled in that survey and they were thinking about a particular context, they identified as surface approach to learning. But one of them might be a carer for an autistic child and might have developed really deep understanding of their support for that child. They're a deep learner in a different context, in a different domain. So yeah. That's what I believe anyway. So I will hand on to, I think Marie had a question.
Yeah. Marie, I don't know whether, Marie, can you get your microphone to work, or do you want me to read it out?
I'd read it out, Sally. I've checked.
Yeah.
You can't get in. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Marie is asking, was it that the students weren't aware of learning tendency, or has it enabled you and your students to be more aware of they're doing the course?
Yeah, the students weren't aware of their learning tendency at all, but I think, yeah, it has, as I was explaining earlier, it has influenced me in my approach to the students. I kind of I know where they're coming from when we're using these online techniques, really, particularly collaborative techniques. The surface learners are perhaps more hesitant to use them and less skilled at using it. They seem to have more problems with software and using the online environment compared to the deep learners who appeared more confident in using those technologies.
Yeah, and she's come back and said there's a mismatch between expectation and why the student is on the course and what the student wants from the course. So there's a difference between schooling and education. Right.
Okay. Yep. So I suppose the anticipation is that we see in front of us, 60 highly motivated students who are very keen on, a career in whatever, diagnostic radiography or teaching or whatever it is that they're signed up for. But we certainly can't expect that in reality. That's the key thing, really.
Thank you, Ian. What about some of the other people on the in the seminar this afternoon? Does anybody else want to ask a question? Some really interesting ideas flying about there, Ian. Thank you, and it will fit in very much with our theme in the LED Research Centre that you're heading up. Yeah. You know, the idea of research and practice in higher education, because it's something that obviously we're all involved in. Right, Liz Bates says no questions, but thank you. Found it really interesting. Anne, do you want to ask your question? And then Denise Brooks. Anne's got a telephone call that she wanted to ask. It was
just to ask, you know, what are you thinking of looking at next? What's your, you know, I presume you've probably got 4 or 5 ideas, but what's your first thing you're going to tackle?
Well, I'd like to extend this further into other groups of students, so I can compare and contrast perhaps groups of students in I don't know, occupational therapy, nursing, teaching perhaps, just to see how they use online collaborative learning and their differences in groups, I suppose, really. And I'm particularly interested in use of social media as well. I alluded to the fact that students were collaborating using social media, WhatsApp, Messenger, and I want to explore that in more depth as well. That's another sort of strand that I want to explore. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Denise, do you want to ask a question?
So I was just wondering whether Ian felt that by allowing the students to use their own pathology in cycle 2, that had encouraged deeper learning. I sometimes find that by giving students a little bit more flexibility in the topic that they actually choose, where their passions are or the patient group that they're looking at, that might encourage deeper learning.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. As I said, the surface learning tendency students were, they didn't say that it was, you know, not a useful use of their time in cycle 2. So I think that contributed to their more accepting of the wiki as a learning object, really. Yeah.
Going forward, I'd be really interested in using wikis with my critical care nurses or acute care nurses in some of their online learning. Right. So I'll drop you an email, and perhaps we could look at expanding it into that group of nurses. That would be really good.
Yeah. I think, yes, particularly at this time, you know, when students are separated, and it is a way of bringing them together to kind of research together, really. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Good.
Thanks. Pete?
Yeah, Ian, I just wondered whether just kind of thinking creatively, imagine if you weren't allowed to use that survey. Imagine if they started charging you for every student you send it to, right? And you said, oh, I'm not doing that. I wondered whether you would speculate about, you know, if you walked into the room, say, or you were watching them online working on their wiki or some other activity, whatever you choose, how you would, you know, could you imagine an alternative method of judging their approach to learning? What might you do if you were observing the students in some way? Do you think it has to be, because the survey is self-report, isn't it?
It is,
it's
yeah.
by the students.
Yeah. I think I could certainly I could work out the students who were surface learners. They come to me at the end of the lecture and say, you know, is this going to be on the exam at the end of the term or whatever? They quite easily identify themselves in that sense. Perhaps deep learners, they would say they would want to, you know, develop the debate or whatever we were discussing in the lecture. They would come up to me at the end and you know, talk to me in more depth, and I would be interested in their views and whatever. And they would probably be the deep learners. So is that one way of discerning the two?
I guess so. I mean, in some work I'm teaching on rubrics at the moment, the surface approach to learner students are the ones who they get a detailed rubric, they still want more and more and more. Right. You know, they want you to say how many citations they should make and how many words they should use and which concepts they should tick the box of. So it's not that I'm against the idea of these categories, these approaches to learning. I do think we have to be very careful how we use them, and also not to label students, but also not to. I feel as though that survey, when I looked at it in detail, I just feel it's a bit flawed in simple ways to do with construction of questionnaires. You know, It has some weird statements on it, I think. Anyway, there you go.
The other alternative is, and there's quite a lot of debate about it, it's self-regulation of learning. That's a more developed in the US and Europe, really.
Right.
So student approaches to learning is a more British way of looking at things, and Australia as well seem to use that more. They're more familiar with those terms. Certainly, when I presented it I was in an international conference last year in Spain, and the American delegates didn't really understand what surface and deep learning was, so I had to explain it to them. But self-regulated learning, as soon as I said self-regulated learning, they were more on board, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess if a student can interpret the feedback from half a dozen modules and then go to their tutor and say, these are my targets for next semester, you could say that was a sign of at least some engagement with themselves as a learner. Maybe that's moving. Maybe that's the way to move them from surface to deep. I don't know.
Yes, that metacognition, isn't it? The way they think about the learning. That's an important aspect to think about as well.
Okay, thanks. Marie had a couple of questions. So she's put, or comments, rather than judging a person's approach to learning, have you thought about asking them what they want to get from your course as a professional practitioner in the making? And then a second point is the assessment tends to focus on students, focus students on surface learning, what they need to pass, rather than what they can get, which contributes to their educational development.
Yeah, coming to the second point, I suppose there is some debate about how we would make the wikis more suitable for deep learning. I suppose that would be one way to how do we change the wiki to make it more suitable for a deep learning approach. What we want to avoid is students simply cutting and pasting information and putting it into the wiki, which we did see some students doing. So to develop it as a deep learning tool, I think there's certainly some mileage in developing the wiki along those lines. The first question was about surface learning, what they need to pass rather than what they can. Oh, I think really I've answered both questions there in that answer, hopefully.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay?
Yeah. I'm just aware of time. So Pete, do you want to ask yours? And if there's time, I'll ask mine. And a couple of people are having to leave now, which is absolutely fine. So thank you, Anne Kendrick, and thanks, Lisa McGregor, for attending. Pete?
Well, I just trying to build on what, this idea of moving them towards deep approaches and some of the things that Marie was saying, really, and sort of trying to get back towards Jack's challenge, about education. For me, I don't know, I fall in the middle there somewhere. If we had authentic assessments, would that be a way, if your radiographers could see that it was authentic, and our nurses and teachers and people like that, if they can see that the task is authentic, like sort of real world, something they might get involved in later in their career, or at least a kind of simulation of that, they, wouldn't that capture some of that? I'm not saying all of the people who are trying to just, tick the boxes and get through the test, but it might capture the attention and engagement of some of the surface approach to learners students. And that, presumably, that is sort of, not completely, but sort of what Jack is saying, that it's about them becoming a radiographer, that their education is more than, and becoming a person, it's not just a technical thing, it's more about who they are and their values and so on. So is it authentic assessment? Would you say that your assessments on your course are reasonably authentic? Was the assessment in the research authentic?
The wikis that we did there, I think so. Yeah, I think it was. It's things that my students are going to need to know, knowledge that they need to know when they're actually working with patients who have these diseases. They can see where, the symptoms and how they're treated and how they're diagnosed as well. So it gives them a broader appreciation of the disease in context, really, aside from just, you know, taking an x-ray and finding out what's wrong with them. It just gives them that broader perspective. So educates them about different areas of diseases. Yeah, but I think you're right, the design of assessment is important, and that's been proven by many studies which say that, you know, by good design of assessment, you can actually promote deep learning approaches. Yeah.
Thanks, Iain. It's just worth noting as well that within the Learning, Education and Development LED Research Centre, we actually have a major international network assessment in higher education, and so, you know, that's where these kind of debates can go ahead. Denise, Jack has just given you a reference from the Education Action Research coming out on pedagogy in higher education. Marie's said not just the knowledge they need to know, but does the course demand of them an attitude to them becoming a professional, taking responsibility for their practice and contributing to the knowledge base. And Denise has said, Denise, I don't know whether you want to talk about your point?
It was just to agree with Pete, really. I'm quite new to academia and had a senior position within clinical practice before I moved into academia, and I think it's a really important point that the students who are training to be professionals have had some sort of authentic assessment process to get them to that point. But I think in the reverse, having come into academia and seeing students for the first time, many of them really value those assessments that are assessments that make them learn rather than them just learning for the assessment as such. So I think it's a really important balance to get the assessment process part of their end product.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. Thank you.
I'm just aware that we've only got 2 minutes left, so I'll let Iain conclude with any final comments, but I'd like to just thank everybody for coming. I'd also just to point out one of my final comments was with my students, I talk about surface strategic and deep and profound learning, and the strategic is the passing the exam, and for some students that's all they want to do, you know. Anyway, Iain, you have the final word.
Oh no, it's been excellent hearing everyone's comments and putting my research in a broader context, I think, as well. That's been particularly useful. You know, I'd like to certainly develop these ideas and explore it in other areas as well. But I think also focusing on, you know, students' approaches to learning and recognizing that students have different approaches is important, and it does, as we can see in my research, it influence how I presented the online learning, having that knowledge of student experience.